In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a brilliant conversation with Chad Renando, Director for the Not-for-Profit Startup Status, Managing Director Australia for the Global Entrepreneurship Network, and a current PhD researcher exploring the connection between entrepreneur ecosystems and community resilience. Chad and I discuss his varied background that spans the US Navy, manufacturing, innovation hubs, and a stint as a radio DJ, and how some of those experiences sparked his interest in the smart regions and smart communities space. We talk about the different types of resilience that communities, especially regional communities, need in this ever-changing world. And also the importance of asking the question, who's not in the room when it comes to smart initiatives? Chad tells us how he sees Australia currently embracing smart concepts and the need for bottom-up approaches driven by the regions rather than top-down solutions handed to them. Chad shares with us a bit about the projects he's currently working on, including his PhD into the role of innovation ecosystems in developing community resilience. We finish our chat discussing why collaboration over competition should be an emerging trend. Now, this month, in December, we're shining a spotlight on the regions, so I really hope you enjoy it. I know I will. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Chad. How are you today?
Good, Zoe. How are you?
I am fantastic. Let's jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, you bet. So a bit of a diverse background. Got my start in manufacturing over in the US. We were manufacturing printed circuit boards, and then also into digital, manufacturing and digital when I came over to Australia. It was around the turn of the century. Seeing kind of both sides of disruption. Went through the domestic manufacturing downturn over in the US, our family business of about 30 years, had the ups and downs through that. And also the rise and dips of the digital scene through .com in 2000, and also seeing the value that digital had in sustaining through the GFC. And so that kind of led me through a few other roles, then into running an innovation hub in Ipswich, which started saying, well, what is the role of these kind of things, entrepreneurship, innovation, in supporting particular regional cities that don't have a lot of the density that you have in metro areas. That then led me to start a PhD, asking similar kind of questions on really what is the role of innovation, entrepreneurship, in building resilience, particularly in regional communities. And that's kind of what I'm doing now. Oh, and also a bit of a background in 5 years in the US Navy and 5 years as a radio DJ.
Oh, cool. So what sparked your interest in this kind of, I'm going to call it smart region space?
Yeah, you bet. So there's a lot of talk around tech, a lot of talk around innovation. And what we've seen, I think, is what started off as a separate thing, both for a region as well as for organizations. Like research and development used to be its own separate department, and we used to do all the new stuff over there while business as usual was kind of the norm. What we're seeing is more of a integration, both at an organization level as well as a society level. And so we're seeing people come together and say, well, how do we incorporate everything, both economic development and community development activities, because innovation has opportunity for both. And in fact, what we see, especially in regional areas, is unless they figure out how to diversify their economy, they are at risk of any market shocks, which can be just as devastating as physical shocks to a region.
Mm-hmm. My next question was, why do you think it is important? And I guess that resilience piece and the resilience piece is one of the key areas why this is important, right?
That's right. And it's resilience not in bouncing back, which when you think about physical disruptions, and I went through the floods in 2011 in Ipswich, you do see the community come back to the way it was. Whereas what we need is the other term that they use, or the other definition of resilience, which is more of a continuous ability to be flexible and to be able to adapt and adjust and be resilient to just the consistent change that we see. And when you think about applying that to smart city, that then starts really incorporating the people side of things. It's not just, as I'm sure you know, and what we saw a couple of years back when we started using the term, a lot of the technology and devices on lampposts and smart wheelie bins. But that is actually really integrating into the livability, into the wholeness of a community across all aspects of the community. Because one of the other challenges that we see with a lot of this innovation narrative, even though globally we are raising the poverty level for everyone, we're also increasing the gaps, which raises a whole bunch of other standards or challenges. So how do we apply our smart cities for everybody in the region, not just for those people who have access already?
We had a chat at the Australian Regional Development Conference, and one of the key areas we were talking about is that being able to provide access to people that, not like you or I, we can already access things, but people that can't access the network now, how do we put them front of mind when we are designing, creating, developing these type of smart city or smart community initiatives?
That's right. And it is a holistic look at technology. And as you mentioned, it's for everyone, but being intentional about that conversation.
So how do you think that Australia is currently embracing this kind of smart city, smart community concept?
So we're seeing a definite interest and a definite demand. Like there's not a region out there that's not looking at how they diversify, how they're asking the questions from a government level, from a university level, the corporates, the investment side of things, obviously startups, entrepreneurs. But I think where I see things going is then how do we get all of those functions working together? So like even the conference that you and I went to, there's a certain segment of people that are in the room at any one of those, but I always have to ask the question, who's not in the room? So I think there's some really good work being done out there by a lot of whether it's the peak bodies like Economic Development Australia or local government associations like LGAQ, or some consultants in the scene. I know Glentworth's doing some good work. You're doing some really good work. But how do we bring it all together? I think that's the next big challenge that we need to face is really, and there's some systemic challenges within Australia that stop us from doing that. But there's a lot of people interested about how do we bring it together.
And I really like asking the question, who's not in the room? Something I've been thinking about as well, because we can all high five each other and whatever. But if you're not bringing all of those different points of view, whether we think that they are useful or not, they are still people's lives and how they see the world. And the more that we can kind of, disagree and have respectful, robust discussion, the better the outcome will be in the end for that inclusive piece and that access piece that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and there's some really good work that's started to be done there. I know a couple of the organizations I work with, one of them is through QUT and the Australian Centre for Entrepreneurship Research, doing some measurement pieces there. And how do we get the data to be able to reflect some of the directions? So I think a lot of this needs to be supported by data. The second piece is around those collaborative bodies, both and through QUT and an announcement recently with the Queensland government and a partnership with MIT and the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program in regions, as well as some of the work that's being done by the Rural Economy Center of Excellence out of USQ, and some of the work that we did down in Gunawindi in building some of these collaborative approaches to have the regions themselves, rather than a top-down approach, really from a bottom-up, providing some of that framework so the regions can kind of develop the answer rather than have it handed to them.
Oh my God, that is so important. And yeah, something that I'm very aware and focused on, I suppose, because I guess it's so different to work with a region than it is to work, I don't even know what the word would be, but tell the region how they should work, I guess, or something like that. I did my thesis on installing renewable energy in remote mountainous Nepal. And the key finding from that is that you work with them and is it that they need solar panels or is it that they need something else? And you only find that out by not going there and going, oh, cool, here's this solution that I have for you. This is great. I'm going to put it here, and this is how you will use it. Actually going in there without a solution and just finding out what their biggest pain points were and then what's in control for you, like what you can do to make a difference. So you might not be able to provide everything. And one of the key things was that when they were cooking inside, they have lots of problems with asthma and then pneumonia because they use open fires inside the house. So they're cooking inside, blah, blah. And so they went, oh, well, we'll just give you an oven or a stove or whatever, and then you don't need to have this fire anymore. And they said, and they weren't using them. They couldn't work out why. And until someone asked them, they said, well, we need the smoke to keep the mosquitoes out of the house, the bugs out of the house. So actually what they needed was fly screens first, then be able to have something that you could, I don't like the word co-create. Well, I use it a bit, but, it sounds a bit wanky, but, actually work with them to find out what stove or oven or whatever that they actually need that wasn't going to create something additional where they already have enough to deal with. So yeah, I mean, that's an overseas example, but it's the same theory. Even cities, it's the same. You don't want to be told what to do, but particularly in our regional areas where we have limited resources, we have limited, well, I don't know about limited skill sets, but different skill sets that we can have access to, and then actually working together to work out what that solution will look like for right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great example, Zoe. And the kind of demonstrates what we're talking about as far as that community development. And we're seeing, rather than being able to go into a region, as you say, here's a bunch of solar panels, or here's some widgets, and we think this will be good for your economy or for your community. It really is saying, well, here's a bit of a shopping list. Here's some principles. And I like to work on principles and scaffolding, providing a bit of a framework for regions, but really, one, letting them develop it. But you mentioned the word capability. One of the challenges that regions have is that they quite often don't have access to some of the knowledge, some of the capabilities, some of the talent. That doesn't mean they're less. It's just there's more density of that kind of skills in metro areas. So how do we go out there and say, well, here's some capability for you, but then you need to determine how to use it. And I think we need to get that mix right. In the past, we've seen initiatives such as lump sums of funding for a region to say, you guys figure it out, without equipping them with both the ability to collaborate as well as the technical skills. And the flip side of that, here's a whole bunch of technical stuff for you to do. But then we've seen a lot of examples where they put that in place and the community still doesn't, they're not sustainable. So we do need that right mix. And I'll caveat all of this as saying it's complex. It's hard for a reason. There is no silver bullet. I think as a nation, we are figuring it out. I am very optimistic about where we are, about where I've seen both smart cities and the entrepreneur innovation ecosystem overall evolve. And I think what we're going to see in the next 12 to 18 months, to be able to learn from what's happened in the last 12 months to 3 or 4 years, it's going to be pretty exciting times.
No, thanks so much for bringing that up, because that's such an important point as well. We really need to make sure that we're not devaluing the skill set that, say we are bringing to the conversation as well. And that the fact that we have that skill set is really key, and that it's a unique skill set that the region may require doesn't mean that, you just step back and go, oh, well, they'll know how to do it. We've developed these techniques and principles and skills for a reason, and it is to actually help the communities and regions and whoever it is, whoever we're engaged with, to access that skill from us or from whoever it is, or the technical ability. Because I agree, I do think sometimes it can go, oh, well, they can just do it, but they don't have the skill sets required. They have other skill sets which are amazing and useful and whatever else, but we can't devalue those other and deep technical skill sets or engagement skill sets or whatever they happen to be, to work together with them. And then also pass on some of that knowledge as well is really, really important. So thanks for bringing that part of it up too, because that's kind of the other side of the coin.
Yeah, you make a good point there as far as passing it on, in that one of the other challenges that we've seen is these initiatives that go in there to help, and I'll use the term loosely, the regions, because there is I get frustrated with this kind of us versus them, metro versus region, going out to save the quote unquote regions, where they're all just really diverse and they're all just unique communities. But also, how do we apply solutions that leave as much resources in the region as possible? Some of the initiatives that we see, particularly globally, go in with an overarching framework, but it takes so much money out of the regions. It's what we've seen, like, say, with the startup accelerators in the past, where it costs so much to actually run the accelerator, it leaves very little to be sustainable in the region for them to embed the learnings that went through. So how do we do these initiatives, but equip the local people on the ground that are capable, they're confident, they're already in that space, and quite often they're the leaders in the community, but equip them with the frameworks and the skills and the tools and the funding to be able to help sustain the work and apply the principles and the technology and the new ways of thinking, so they can be sustainable and, in fact, exceed anything that we could have thought in the first place.
No, I love that. I think, that exceed is really key, because I think using the term region, again, very loosely, because I live in not super regional, but Toowoomba, and I grew up in Roma, and I guess I didn't realize that there was this them versus us thing going on. But yes, I don't think we should talk about regions as a lower, I don't know what the word would be, a lower, I guess, demographic or anything like that. It's just different, and people want a different lifestyle. And there are so many rich skill sets in regions that where that access that we were talking about before, that becomes so important, both digital and physical. So then we can actually, that those people with those skill sets, and then people leaving that resource and access to those skill sets is when, people move out of an area is really, really key. So yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up as well. I really want to talk about you. So tell me about the things that you've been doing lately.
Yeah, you bet. So doing a few things. After I left the Innovation Hub, I worked with the Office of the Queensland Chief Entrepreneur for a while. And when I was there, I built a platform to help hubs and programs measure their impact over time. And I did that as a bit of an experiment, because innovation hubs as a concept is a bit of a distressed business model, needing to be subsidized in order to provide the extra support for entrepreneurs in some way. But because they're typically struggling on resources, they lack the ability to measure consistently. Plus, we have a lot of money going into innovation, and how do we measure the outcome? So I started getting into that space, which now sees me working with QUT and working with an overarching project on how do we measure entrepreneur activities overall, to the point where now they've developed an approach where you can pretty much give them any cohort, and it'll tell you how that cohort is performing against the overall norm of entrepreneurs and businesses across Australia. So it's pretty innovative and world leading. So pretty excited about just being involved with that team. Still developing the platform on my own as well to provide it for hubs and programs and measure impact, as well as working with USQ, as I mentioned before, on these regional collaborative bodies. And most recently working within Goondiwindi and Julia Telford down there in the council, and some of the local innovators. We're really just building a lot of momentum around the Goondiwindi Innovation Network down there. So really exciting outcomes that we're going to be seeing in the next 12 months there. And all of that plus working hard to finish my PhD, which hopefully I'll be submitting towards the end of the year, which will free me up to do some more exciting things. Excellent.
And can you tell us a little bit more about your PhD?
So I'm looking specifically at the research question, what is the role of the Innovation Hub as a construct in building resilience, particularly in regional communities? And to develop the question, I took about 1.5 years traveling around the world a bit, traveling around Australia, just saying, well, what is this innovation ecosystem? How does it work? How is it funded? What are the different actors? I'm taking a very open approach, just treating everything open as an actor, not trying to be too prescriptive on who does what, and letting the people speak to what they do. I hit the road towards the end of last year on a 3-month tour across Queensland, just living on the road, talking to every government, Chamber of Commerce, university, innovation hub, entrepreneur, small business I could find, investor, university, et cetera, and collect all that data, about 180 interviews, and now I'm going through processing it. And what I came up with, I was actually surprising in that, as you do with PhDs, quite often not getting to the outcome you expect. I identified that the innovation hubs are trying to do too much. So for an innovation hub to survive, it needs the ecosystem as well, right? So you find these innovation hubs already struggling to support local entrepreneurs and build that capacity, then trying to engage with local council and get their chamber on board and build up the local investment community and engage with the university and tap into the high school for local talent and all these activities that have to do with actually building the ecosystem, which quite often have nothing to do with actually running a physical innovation hub. So that pointed me to this notion of building these collaborative bodies. And there's this approach called collective impact, which is typically pointed at really complex challenges in society that no single entity can address, like poverty, homelessness, global spread of disease. And now that's being pointed more and more towards supporting entrepreneurs and economic diversity in regional areas. And then for these backbone, or for this collective impact to work, it needs an entity called a backbone organization, which in Australia we're seeing these loosely formed steering committees form up, which then turns into a mission-oriented not-for-profit. So I'm experimenting with those a little bit as well, just trying to identify what is the appropriate framework that would help regions across Australia and globally. We're looking at the likes of the Aspen Institute and Kauffman Foundation over in the US to say, this is a challenge worldwide on low density areas, developing economic diversity. What are the structures that would help all of us do it faster for the betterment of more people?
Excellent. Yeah. And I was really interested to hear some of your early findings or at that conference we were at as well. And, looking at that massive web of people and activity, well, actors in the space. So yeah, that's really interesting. Talking about webs and I guess integrating, how do you think we can better integrate across the different disciplines, governments, these hubs, industries, communities?
It's a range of things, Zoe. Like that web you mentioned before, that network map, it is just so connected. One of the interesting things about that, when you start mapping all the networks and who deals with what, you start identifying these super nodes who are connected to more people. And I think it's making those super nodes more efficient, because what we find is these nodes, whether it's an organization or an individual, become successful. And that's almost the worst thing that can happen, because then they start slowing down and becoming inefficient. And so how do we create the structures? And that's why I'm really interested in these organizations, whether it's a peak body for entrepreneurs or something to make that process more efficient. And I don't think we have that right yet, but I think models are emerging, which I'm excited about. Media plays a huge role. Even what you're doing here with the work that you do, Zoe, I think it's incredible. And just getting the word out, sharing the stories, the case studies. When I did my interviews, I asked a few things. One is I asked who owns or who's accountable for entrepreneur support in your region. And quite often I hear it's either everyone, at which point it's no one because there's no accountability, or it's this particular person, but quite often it's a different person in the community or that one person, again, as I mentioned, so it's getting bogged down. So the role of media is pretty big in helping to share the story, to get the word out. We need to get that network mapping faster and faster, all those points between the connectivity piece. One of the aspects about Australia is we are a regional nation, and that's just not going to change. We are spread out with a relatively low population density. But I think we can actually use that as our advantage. When I went over to the US at a conference, they flew me over and I got excited because it was about 400 or 500 ecosystem leaders, people doing this kind of work. And I was really looking forward to learn from them. But then they looked to me and said, okay, great, Chad, we're glad you're here. How can we do regional innovation better? Which is a bit confronting, but also a bit exciting, because globally, if we're struggling with it, that means that can be our exportable product. So we can figure out how to do what density in a central area gives us, but do that instead of through physical systems of being next to each other in those serendipitous collisions, how do we do that through digital systems or social systems? And again, I think, Zoe, the work that you do through just getting the word out and the word out in these podcasts is part of it. The connecting the leaders in different regions is part of it. Conferences is part of it. Finding a more virtual way to do things. So I think all of that collectively together, I think, is going to form something pretty exciting in the next couple of years.
Excellent. I'm loving being able to do this and share those stories. And I'm getting more and more feedback now that I've got a bit of an audience and a following, that, it's been really helpful for people, and also making those connections. And I've spoken on the podcast previously when I just love on LinkedIn seeing, people that didn't know each other before, but they were both guests on my podcast, so they have something in common, then now connecting on LinkedIn, and then, starting their own podcasts as well. I was having a chat last week with somebody who said, oh, well, I was inspired by your podcast, so I started my own. And I love that, because the more people are talking about, the more stories, more real stories that we can share from a real people perspective, as in like our own perspective, not necessarily from what a company, wants to tell us or whatever, I think is so key to actually opening up the conversation with more and more people, which only leads to more and more connections and more interactions in the digital and then physical world when you get to meet these people. If we are, attending these conferences, and like conferences in particular, doing those more virtually or more strategically, where, we might do a couple virtual ones during the year or something like that, but then we make an effort to kind of, meet people in person or whatever, once or twice a year or something like that. So then we can actually have both, the best of both worlds in that space. Because I think that is important. I think a lot of people stop themselves from interacting with someone until they've met them in person. A lot of people have said that they need to meet people in person first, but sometimes that's just not possible. And I don't think we should hold back. But I do think we should also then, if we are in the same place at the same time or work out a place to be in the same time, it's also really, really important to kind of deepen that connection, or just brings a different dimension to your connection that you have, I suppose.
Yeah, it raise good point, Zoe, with regards to the connections, not just with the people in your community, but within your technology, within the domain that you're interested in, within your industry sector, a range of things, and also globally, because we're quite often, we talk smart cities, smart communities, innovation, and we talk about how do we access and be globally competitive. And I'm really interested in part of the work I'm doing through one of my other roles, which is acting director for Australia for the Global Entrepreneurship Network, is mapping out a precinct to precinct relationship. So for a region, whether it's Roma, whether it's Charleville, whether it's Goondiwindi, how do we get them tapped into potentially just one or two other global, not just cities, but precincts, get this hub talking to that hub almost from day one. So they can start, and you map out these hubs based on a common strength within the region. And it's around focusing on what are the strengths of that region, not just agriculture, not just tourism, because all regional Australia has those assets to offer quite often, but really down to the specific, what can be known for that we can compete globally on? And I think that's the question that needs to start first, as compared to, how do we innovate? It's what are we known for, and let the innovation naturally come out from that.
No, I think that's so important. And I guess starting to just have those conversations and set up those networks, from day one, and just making it kind of normal, I guess, to collaborate, I think is really important, because sometimes, particularly older industries or, industry groups or collective, groups of people or whatever, they might have only ever connected with one or two other groups, but they really were self-sustaining or whatever. Whereas now that that's changing, you do need to open up your network, and things that weren't connected before, as in, I don't mean connecting to the internet, but that probably could be one. But, even industries that weren't connected before are now suddenly connected because of one thing that's changed, or an emerging thing that's going to change, or, that cross-disciplinary approach that we need to have in smart communities. So, yeah, I think it's so important.
And that example you gave of connecting the internet, that's a perfect one in that. I remember, I'm old enough to remember, when the internet first came into being, the old 56K and whatever it was, like 32, 34 before that, with that noise that it made. And to connect the internet, it was like a really big thing. You had to have somebody wire a bunch of stuff, and you plug something out of your phone into your computer. And it was really a hassle, and only a few people could do it. But now we don't even think about it. Everything's connected. Pretty soon our bodies are going to be connected. It's just a given. And you go to a business that's not connected, and that's like an anomaly. And I think the same thing on connecting to the soft side of things is going to happen. Businesses will just get it. It's just taking a little bit longer. And some of the leading people that were doing this for the last 5 years or so think, hey, how come everybody's not doing this? But 2 or 3 years, we're not going to be able to say that anymore. Everything's going to catch up, and we're going to have to keep looking to what's next.
So what are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
So I'll answer that by a bit of frustration around what people do talk about, which is quite often, and again, I come very much from the community and social side rather than the technical side. I let other people kind of deal with, technical AI and blockchain, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not as heavy in that space, but the social side of things, we're still talking about us versus them. We're still talking about Melbourne versus Sydney, Queensland versus New South Wales, this region versus that region, and it's just, it slows us down. The competitive nature, Australia is a very competitive nation, and it's great. We have an awesome sporting culture. When I got into this and first came to the country, I already talked about tall poppy. Initially, I said, "Oh no, it's not a thing," but it kind of is, and it comes from a fear-based approach. Australia as a nation, across the indicators for entrepreneurial perception, fear of failure is huge, and I think it is because we've had it so good for so long. There's a lot of complex things that go into that aspect of our culture. So as far as where I would love to see things go, again, I just keep coming back to more of that collaborative approach. And so again, I'll go back to my optimism in that I do see it happening. I think the way to address not being collaborative is not to speak out against it per se, but to create the examples of what it could look like. And I think that's why a lot of times the innovation ecosystem overall can be so compelling if we get it right, because it is a culture of give first. It is a culture of how can I help? And if we can get that model right, I think collectively we'll be able to advance a lot faster as compared to a zero-sum game and everybody just trying to get their piece of the pie rather than growing the pie overall, to use a well-used cliche.
Excellent. Thanks so much for coming onto the podcast, Chad. I really appreciate it.
You bet, Zoe. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I really have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
Yeah, you bet. So you can reach out to me both through email, chad@startupstatus.co, that's startupstatus.co. And then from there, and also on LinkedIn, just search for Chad Renando, and my phone number is on there. Feel free to give me a ring. And anybody who's passionate or working on collaborative approaches in particularly regional areas, love to have a chat. Or if you're interested in mapping and measuring innovation or startups or impact, focusing at the moment on Australia, happy to have a chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for coming on to the podcast. And I look forward to our next conversation. We'll have to catch up again soon.
Great. Thanks, Zoe.
Talk soon. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcasts. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.